Well, hello. I see that we're up to about 63 attendees, so we're going to go ahead and get started here. Greetings from Anselm House. My name is Andrew Hansen. I'm the program director at Anselm House, and I want to welcome you to this very first Anselm House online webinar. So special welcome to you if you are new to the Anselm House community. I know that many of you are likely to be tuning in, joining us for the first time. Anselm House is a community of students, of faculty, staff here at the University of Minnesota, as well as many friends from outside of the university who are pursuing together the connection of Christian faith and knowledge with all of life. So we're committed to exploring the relevance of Christianity for every part of life, including our study and our work here in the different disciplines at the University of Minnesota. At Anselm House, we believe that faith is not just a private matter that's somehow separate from the rest of our lives, but for those of us who are Christians in this season of Lent, as we lead up to Easter in particular, we're reminded that the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ changes everything for us. And so our faith in Christ has deep implications for how Christians live and engage the world in all different areas. This is a first for us, the public webinar. It's the first time that we've hosted an exclusively online event. At Anselm House, we are big fans of seeing one another face-to-face and in person. And that's because we believe that God made us as embodied creatures. So we're not just minds, or in the words of James K.A. Smith, the philosopher, brains on sticks. But we have bodies, and that's a good thing. And it's good for us to be physically present with one another and not just virtually. So as you would imagine, this shift to having an exclusively online presence that's required in this period of social distancing is a challenge for us, as I know it is for all of you. But nonetheless, we're deeply grateful that technologies like Zoom allow us to continue to stay connected at a distance, even if it's just virtually during this period of disruption that we're all feeling. So to that end of staying connected, we're going to host a series of these Zoom conversations for the Anselm House community. And specifically, we're designing these with University of Minnesota students in mind, but we're going to make them open to the wider public as well. So we're going to start out with a few conversations really focused on understanding this present moment and crisis that we're in, the COVID-19 pandemic and the enormous challenges that presents to us, as well as specifically the call to Christians to live out their faith in the midst of these kind of disruptions, sufferings, and hardships. And so we want to connect with you as much as possible during this time. And so invite you, we're up to 73 participants now, would invite you at any time during the webinar today to submit questions for John. You can go ahead and submit those as soon as they come to mind. And then in the second half of this hour, we're going to be able to pull those questions, put them to John, and stay connected with all of you. So today we are going to be starting off in conversation with Dr. John Deen. And John is a professor here at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Veterinary Population Medicine. And the Department of Veterinary Population Medicine is right across the street from the study center here. In fact, looking out the windows, I can see it right over there. John is a swine epidemiologist by training. That means he's an expert in the health and disease in pig populations. But his interests and his experience really go far beyond swine health, as we're going to hear about soon. For 7 years, John served as the project director for the OneHealth Workforce, which is a USAID-funded global initiative that is focused on assessing and responding to the threat of infectious disease, which, again, I'm going to invite him to say quite a bit more about in just a moment. And John is also a close friend of Anselm House. John has been he's been on our board of trustees. He's a faculty fellow at Anselm House this year. And so we're delighted to have you with us, John. John, thank you for being here today.
Thanks very much for the invitation, and I look forward to the discussion.
Where are you joining us from today, John?
I'm joining you from a cabin in Wisconsin, to be honest, and isolation at a different level.
Appropriately socially distanced from us. John, I think you were the first person who first brought my attention to the significant threat that this new coronavirus might pose to the world. So I think it was back in January. I recall you saying at the faculty fellows meeting that the spread of this new virus, which was then limited to China, might actually be sort of the most disruptive event to our global society since World War II. And I remember that really surprising me at the time and making me pay very close attention to what was developing then in China. Am I remembering those comments correctly?
Yes, you are correct. And we also discussed, I think I discussed asking, how should we pray in this time of uncertainty?
Right, right. And since then, John has continued to offer guidance for us at Anselm House as we were trying to figure out what this threat meant and adjust our own planning and programming to respond to it. So, John, thanks so much for being with us in this. Before we get down to specifics of COVID-19, I wonder if you can tell us about your work. So, specifically, how is it that somebody that studies swine populations is able to help us understand what is going on in this present COVID-19 situation?
I guess I should explain that I grew up on a pig farm in southern Ontario, and I became a veterinarian to work in animal agriculture. Went towards emphasizing one species, mainly being pigs. The joke always is for veterinarians that we do a lot more species than anybody else does, but takes a lot more brains than I had. But the other part is I'm a numbers geek, and so I gravitated towards epidemiology, understanding the math of disease and mortality. And one of the secrets is much of our training is done jointly between human doctors and veterinarians because the math is the same. And probably the difference is that in our animal populations, we've seen more epidemics over the last while than the human population has seen. And so I've been involved in a number of livestock pandemics. But about 10 years ago, I was invited, as you mentioned, to be project director of something called the Emerging Pandemic Threats Project. Myself, along with a number of faculty at the University of Minnesota, got involved in preparing countries and especially their professionals and especially their academics to understand the threat of new diseases and create plans for response. And that was mainly done in Southeast Asia and in Central Africa, and we continue to be in touch with those areas. Let me just bring up one slide and to explain some of my training. And let me just, sorry, I'm going to, whoops. And I'm a bit nervous about this, doing this for the first time. But I want to emphasize how do we serve and what was impressive in a lot of the communities that we planned, we went through planning exercises was the real question, how do we serve wisely? But one of the first lessons we had to discuss was this idea of an exponential growth of a disease, of a threat. And I keep on coming back to this example of paper folding. And as it says, you can refold it. You can refold a sheet of paper in half 10 times. That's about the max, and it's the width of your hand. 17 folds of a piece of paper as high as a house, and you see that another 35 folds brings you to the sun, and that's why many of us in the community had those concerns in January already about this novel virus that spread quickly and and multiplied exponentially within populations.
Thank you, John. As somebody that has spent a lot of time over the years as part of this project thinking about the ways that pandemics develop and unfold, I'm wondering if you can give us a sort of brief layperson's overview of this coronavirus in particular. So for those like me that aren't scientists or epidemiologists, what is this thing? How exactly do we get a virus like this emerging? And what in particular is new or different about this coronavirus?
And let me just take you to this slide. This coronavirus, the official name is Sars coronavirus type 2, and it causes the disease COVID-19 that you hear about. And coronaviruses are really common in many different populations and species. And we see it within the common cold. We see it in pigs that I work with, in expressions of pneumonia, especially in naive populations or populations that have not seen the disease. We see it expressing itself in diarrhea as well. One of the characteristics of a new disease is it has to come from somewhere. And in most cases, it comes from animals. It may have modified itself somewhat to be able to pass over from animals to humans, or in other cases, the contact, the interaction between especially wild animals such as bats, probably the source in this case, and humans has increased or changed due to environmental degradation. It can be due to new consumption habits, and in turn, we see it cropping up in various societies that have changed some of their behaviors over time. And so that's the basic aspects of this coronavirus. Interestingly enough, we've had a couple other cases of coronavirus. One is called Sars, that some of you may probably remember from a number of years back. We've recently had a disease called MERS as well, and excuse me for a minute. I have a dog that is just going to need to go outside.
As a good veterinarian should. So yeah, feel free again at any point if you're just tuning in, you can feel free to drop questions in for John now. Those will collect and we'll be kind of going through those and sorting them, and then we're going to take the entire second half hour here to ask those questions of John.
Yeah, sorry, I'm back. We just had a visitor even out here. The aspect that I want to emphasize is we've had these other expressions of coronavirus leaking out from various species into the human species. What differs for this disease is probably two main things. Number one is that it spreads even before people know they're sick. And so it has an opportunity to spread silently through a population, and we can't use
John, was that not the case with SARS and MERS?
No. SARS, you were pretty sick before you experienced the disease, and MERS pretty well is there as well.
Okay.
And on top of that, it spreads through aerosol, which is the most efficient way of spreading a disease in most cases. And then after that, and beyond that, each sick person under normal circumstances infects a large number of people, and at least 2 to 3 people, and therefore that exponential relationship starts driving it quite quickly.
Is the rate at it which it spreads at all related to the fact that it is the sort of case fatality rate is lower than SARS and MERS?
Not really. The case fatality rate, the fatalities, time between infection and death is actually quite prolonged.
Okay.
So it's not taking people out that quick. This sounds quite dispassionate, but that death is not a factor in spread. What is a factor is that it affects people unequally. All of you probably have seen the estimates that that older people are much more susceptible to mortality than younger people. People with pre-existing conditions, such as myself, with a lymphoma, have certain susceptibilities that complicate this disease. And I should add on top of that access to medical care is a factor in this disease, and therefore we're particularly concerned about the spread of this disease in poorer countries. Sub-Saharan Africa is a major concern. And beyond that, simply because of contact rates, caregivers, both medical, within senior facilities and the like, are also much more susceptible. And it's that population that carries the majority and the brunt of the mortality due to this disease, while in younger people, we see very little expression.
Thanks, John. You started out talking about the exponential growth and the possibilities of exponential growth. By now, all of us are familiar with this language of flattening the curve, using social distancing to flatten the curve. But I'm not sure, myself included, we all understand exactly what that means. So again, I'm wondering if you can give us a very basic overview of what's going on with this talk of flattening the curve. And then what's your assessment of these social distancing measures? Are these needed? Is this in any way an overreaction to what's happening? And if not, why not, John?
The graph that many of you have seen, that without protective measures and with protective measures, the flattened curve, is really designed to meet and reduce the number of cases per month, per week, whatever measure, to a level below the healthcare system capacity. In other words, there's enough beds for the people that need them. Not only beds, but equipment, especially equipment to help people breathe when they have a severe pneumonia. And that is the reason for us to stop what we normally do, to essentially stop our economy and stop many of our social enterprises, to be able to allow the healthcare system capacity to meet the needs. Frankly, we're not as bad as without any measures, but experience from Italy, Spain, and other countries is, even with the protective measures even staying in place, we are still going to have cases which cannot be addressed by the current healthcare system capacity. To put it frankly, there are going to be deaths due to this shortcoming. And I have to point out, we see the concerns and the reports from Northern Italy. They actually have a higher per capita amount of healthcare, especially beds and respiratory equipment, than we do in the United States. our competitive system has resulted in a very high efficiency of usage of our healthcare system capacity under normal times, but it has very little surge capacity.
Hmm. So, as an epidemiologist, you see these measures as extremely necessary steps that we have to take at this moment.
Yes, and I see the commentary, and the question is questions on how much um, economic cost can our society carry without without t- with the challenge of trying to meet the needs of essentially a subpopulation of aged and susceptible individuals.
Mm.
And that's especially something for us as Christians to address as we um, we start deciding how we act as a society. Let me give you a sense of hope, however. Here's another epidemiologic model that we use all the time. Essentially, most of us are susceptible to a disease at this point. A, a growing proportion of our population is going to be infectious, which again drives the rate of disease. But the hope is, and the evidence is, that the majority of people who are infected will be recovered. And those of you who follow the testing concerns, and there is a real concern about not knowing where we are. We epidemiologists like to have the data on who is infectious to populate our curves and also to make good decisions. But the other part is knowing which people are recovered, which people have the antibodies, are immune to the disease. And we're not sure how long people will maintain immunity, and in some cases they'll go back to being susceptible.
Hmm.
But we need to understand that in more detail. And the hope is that much of our economy can be maintained by those who have recovered from the disease, and we can start getting to work again. And in there is something called herd immunity. Over time, enough people are recovered that actually the disease doesn't transmit as well either, that we rely on the not only our own immunity, but the immunity of the people around us.
Hmm. So, John, as a follow-up to that, I'm wondering if you can give us a sense of kind of the months ahead. So if we're successful initially with achieving what public health officials hope we're achieving with this kind of first round of social distancing, given what you know about epidemics in the past, pandemics, what's sort of that likely course ahead? Are we going to have sort of future rounds of social distancing? What does that look like over the next month?
Yeah, I put up this slide because I think this is a broader question than simply what is going to happen. And are we going to have further rounds of disease in the future? It really depends how many people become infected in the first round. And so the cost, and that's part of the question of the social cost. Many people point out that a flattened curve will mean a longer time that society is not functioning as we expect, that the economy is not functioning as we expect, that we don't get back to doing our classes face to face, both at Anselm House and in the university. And we have to take that into account as we allow that relationship to develop between the two. And frankly, we don't have a lot of the data right now to understand. and that's going to take active decision making by our governments, by society, on how much of the disease do we allow to leak through. Because we have to understand that there's real cost to society in isolation from each other, in distress to many individuals, either just due to the isolation, due to unemployment, fiscal problems. In some areas, it results in malnutrition, and in some cases, it results in an increase in violence. One of the things we saw time and time again during the Ebola epidemic in Western Africa is the fact that the economy and social activity slid to a halt. Is that agriculture, food distribution was limited. There was more person-to-person violence, especially within households. There was an increase in racism and xenophobia, and in some cases, governments were threatened, and political instability is a real concern as well. So we are going to go through monitoring. Hopefully, we'll get better treatment over time that will allow more cases to be handled within the hospitals, but it will be probably a cyclic activity in number of cases and responses until we get to the point that most of the herd, most of the population is immune, and we have that herd immunity.
John, I see questions are starting to roll in, and I'm watching the time, so we've got time for one more of my questions before we take audience questions here. But you are, as we said, not only a scientist, but a Christian. And I know from conversation with you that you're thinking deeply about what the church should be doing in this time, how Christians should be responding to pandemic. So I'm wondering if you can think with us a little bit, share with us some of the thoughts that you've been having about that. What should we as Christians be doing in this particular moment? And specifically, students at the University of Minnesota, faculty, staff here at the University of Minnesota, those in the Twin Cities. What steps should we be taking right now?
I bring up this prayer that is from Wuhan and from a pastor there, that Christ's peace is not to remove us from disaster and death, but rather to have peace in the midst of disaster and death, because Christ has already overcome these things. And I keep on coming back in my prayers and my understanding of what is before us, that I pray for peace and for healing. The image some of you may recognize is from Jordan, and it reflects the bronze serpent that was raised in the midst of the Israelites by Moses to give healing. And we don't know everything that is going to happen, but peace is there. I want to leave you with a prayer because it was many years ago that epidemics were a major concern about the church. You can read even about Martin Luther addressing an outbreak of bubonic plague in his city. And let me just repeat this as well. Mighty and merciful God, to whom alone belong the issues of life and death, in this time of grievous sickness, we flee unto thee for relief. Deliver us, we beseech thee, from our peril. Give strength and skill to thy ministers of healing. Bless the means of cure, and grant that, perceiving how frail is our earthly life, we may apply our hearts unto that heavenly wisdom which leads to eternal life, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Mm-hmm. And that's from an older Book of Common Prayer that has since been edited out, at least in part.
Mm.
And so it's an understanding, it's a peace, and it's a knowledge of realizing that we need to, we have social responsibility not only to be connected, but also disconnected. And I actually fight against the term social distancing. I think it's physical distancing that we need, and we need more than ever to develop those social connections, especially those that feel threatened, that are in peril, and that's my prayer.
One of the things I love about that prayer is it's an acknowledgement of the sovereignty of God, and yet a prayer for strength and skill to us, so that praying and acting, going hand in hand, that they're not separable. We've got time now to go to audience questions here, and let's see. One of these here is a follow-up on the social distancing or physical distancing, and it's how long is that period of social separation going to need to be in place to be effective? And I'm thinking this is referring just to kind of the first round in dealing with this first wave. What have we, maybe one of the questions is, have we seen this kind of procedure done with previous epidemics? And what does that look like in terms of the length? How is this maybe similar or different in terms of the length of that response?
Yeah, we even have examples in the Bible of the lepers being thrown outside the city, and they had a long-term infectious period. The infectious period for an individual is shorter, so the question is, how high is that peak of the epidemic? If we don't have it under control, the period can be relatively short, but we will see that increased mortality in our susceptible population. If we are successful, we're taking off a few months of our normal activities to allow it to spread more slowly through our populations, and live with some of the deficits that we have, both monetarily and socially.
Another question here that I think ties in nicely with that one. Can we expect less, more, or similar number of cases with these protective measures overall? So what can you tell us about sort of what we should expect to see in terms of the number of cases going forward as we do these measures, and maybe help give us a sense for that compared to if we weren't to take the measures, if you're at all able to kind of wager what that looks like?
Yeah, the models, and I admit they're models based on in some cases limited data, but their best estimates is probably 60% of the population will experience the virus. Whether or not that's cases depends on individuals' response to the virus, but that's our definition of that. The estimate is that about 10% are in real peril. So, and flattening the curve doesn't mean less cases. Unfortunately, it means probably about the same number of cases in the end, but simply over a longer period of time.
Here's a question about comparison to SARS. So it says, I've heard that SARS is less transmissible but far more deadly. What accounts for that disparity? So maybe if you could just share the experience that we had with SARS versus this novel coronavirus. What's similar, what's different, and what accounts for those differences?
I recognize from the list that I have a fellow veterinarian who's a pathologist who could probably answer that better. But every disease has its own mark on how it affects a human. And we have coronaviruses that have an affinity for children and babies, for instance. This one has an affinity for people who are already compromised to a certain extent, and the actual way that this virus is killing people is not that well known. It involves the development of something called an interstitial pneumonia, and I've already experienced it due to influenza, and it's not a comfortable pneumonia, as an aside. And um, and different agents transmit at different levels and have those different characteristics as far as pathology goes. But that's better for another person to separate on that basis. Another example is Ebola virus, of having a different level a very high level of pathogenicity of causing death, but transmission, in spite of all that we heard, was actually pretty simple, and pretty low on average if we take some basic steps into account.
John, here's a question from Bree, a veterinary student here at the U. She's wondering, we know the incubation period is about 2 to 14 days, and that they're starting to shed the virus at this time. But her question is, once they start showing clinical signs, for how long will they continue to shed the virus? So once, and if we know kind of once they've recovered, is there any sense for how long they might continue to be contagious?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And Bree, you probably guessed that we don't have enough testing done in many cases to understand that. Our best experience is out of China, and we have to admit that everything's on a bell-shaped curve. That there's a mean or an average estimate as far as a range that covers some percentile, and so the guidance at this point is following expression of first of all, of being potentially exposed to the virus. Isolation is for 14 days, and that probably covers about 99%. Okay. And that includes a time and that's the time to potentially see expression of the disease. From the time when the disease starts expressing itself until it stops expressing itself, especially fever and cough, the current recommendations from CDC, if I remember correctly, are 3 days after a fever stops is the safety point, and that being the last end point. If cough still occurs, that's still a concern, and we're mostly monitoring fever.
Here's a question about children. So Ted is saying that it seems like children are not as affected by the virus in the same way as vulnerable adults. I'd be curious to hear, John, your reflections on that. Is that different from what we've seen with some of these other coronaviruses or not? But the follow-up to that is it okay for children to play together outdoors if they're coming from places that are not exposed to carriers? So what do we do with children in this time?
Yeah, it's one of those balancing questions when we don't have enough information. We know that children are not as susceptible to expressions of the disease, though there are cases where that is occurring. The second part is we know that at least some children do become infected and transmit the disease to other individuals. Whether or not that's a very high percentage is unknown. the recommendation for social distancing between children is is out of not even an abundance of caution. I'd say just a modicum of caution at this point, knowing that even though their contacts may not have seen expression of the disease, there can still be expression due to the fact that they are simply not expressing the disease very much, maybe a tickle in the back of the throat and maybe feeling a bit slowed down, but nothing much more. And then secondly, we simply don't know how to monitor it. And thirdly, every person has the potential to pass it on to others, who in turn pass it on to susceptible, at-risk people in our population. So the whole idea of clamping it down, the transmission, I don't think we can make exceptions.
David wants to know, do you have any thoughts on some of the new treatments that are being discussed or proposed in the news? I think I've seen some things on antiviral medications that are starting to be tried. Do any of those look promising to you based on what you know about this disease?
Yeah, some of the results are promising, and University of Minnesota is involved in some of those assessments. And if they and there's really two levels of treatment. One is to treat people who have early signs or potential exposure to reduce their likelihood of transmission. We're pretty far away from that level of usage of many of these antivirals. And the other aspect is that we should see a decrease of mortality in those that are severely affected, and some of that, there's been variable results on those that already have an interstitial pneumonia that are in severe respiratory distress. So identifying them early will be important. Um, and the FDA and others are working very hard on allowing that research to occur. And then we need to ramp up production of those products as well. So it's got a timeline, and another reason to flatten the curve to allow technology to catch up with the disease. And that's an opportunity as well. I think the number was there were 81 residents in the nursing home in Kirkland, Washington, and the mortality was 23. And so again, the effect can bite, and this mortality rate was addressed by quite heroic measures, but still we have that at-risk population.
This person wants to know what strengths and weaknesses of the healthcare system have been highlighted by this pandemic. And it doesn't say specifically whether it's the US healthcare system or globally, but I'm curious, what's been your observations around sort of our preparedness and how we're responding to this?
That goes back to my time working within a broad structure called the Global Health Security Agenda. And in turn, we had a set of projects called Emerging Pandemic Threats. And part of that exercise was to evaluate different countries on their ability to address occurrences such as this. Overall, we have many concerns in many countries. The three elements are number one, a scientific capacity to do the analysis within a country and understand what is happening and project forward to make good decisions. And the U.S. is very good at that aspect. The CDC has a number of assets that are not replicated anywhere in the world. Then there is the capacity to respond to those threats and organize uh, our resources, whether it be hospitals, public health, individuals, and the like. And much of that is on a state-to-state level within the United States. And there's large variation from state to state, country to country, to be able to respond. I should add, fortunately, Minnesota leads in many areas of providing a response capacity, and they've planned on many eventualities that we are going to face, and I've been very impressed there. The third area is governance. And it's one of those conundrums at this point that centralized authoritarian governments who are quick to react and tend to be more successful than more individualistic, in some cases, slower to act democratic, in some cases libertarian governments even, that don't have that central government. An example would be Singapore, that you can't spit on the street, and controlling individuals' behavior is something that is within society. Rwanda is another example of very strong governance of social activities, including social distancing, and the like. And we're in the middle. And it's going to be some tough decisions that government needs to make on liberties, on the use of data. Remember, that's a susceptible, infectious, recovered set of classifications. Having that public and having that available to various aspects of society will be very useful. For instance, if you're recovered and you're immune, you'd be a good person to actually work within a nursing home, especially if you're tested for the presence of the virus. But that means a release of medical information and status that currently our statutes don't really account for. And so we've got to make some changes, and we've got to expect some there. And the final aspect is simply the status of our healthcare system, and simply realizing at this point we don't have that much slack capacity in our system to account for extra problems and challenges such as this.
On that final point, John, there's a couple of questions here on questions of sort of limited resources and decisions that physicians have to make with limited resources. So the one is pointing to the situation in Iran and northern Italy, where they're already having to make these sort of triage decisions. And there's another question of just about that generally. So how physicians make those decisions, what that sort of rationing process looks like. I wonder, could you say, I seem to recall that you are familiar with that in Minnesota. Can you say a little bit about what that process looks like?
There's two aspects to this. Number one is that it's really problematic to have individual professionals make that decision. I've mentioned this isn't triage like you watched in MASH, where Hawkeye decided who gets on the table first. It's more like triage on the Titanic, who gets into the rescue boat, which is which depends on policy where it is done right, and it's being developed in many state plans. And I always have difficulty describing this because We've done it a great deal in Africa. When we talk about medical resources in Africa, I've explained that first time I went to Democratic Republic of Congo, I had to realize quite quickly that the GDP per person in DRC at that point was less than the amount that it cost to raise and feed a pig for a year in Minnesota.
Mm.
And therefore, the decisions of rationing healthcare were pretty similar to the economically constrained models I have in veterinary medicine. And that's hard to describe. What's different is that we have something in terms of health policy called disability adjusted life year analysis. And most of our evaluations have focused on the idea that those who have the greatest potential for further life, especially without disabilities, it should receive those medical resources first. It's kids first, and not people who have the best medical insurance. And that hasn't been a discussion here in the United States in the past, but or in the recent future, but that needs to be discussed again. That is being discussed again. And as I shared with some, I've got a limited number of disability adjusted life years left, and realizing I'm low on the list is part of the reason I'm in my cabin in Wisconsin as part of preservation.
I want to turn to a few questions here about responses. So CJ, one of the students, one of our fellows in the Anselm House Residential Fellows community, is curious about the balance between not having physical contact with people and caring for people through physical means. So she's thinking about food delivery, handouts, attending to a family. How do we navigate that balance of maintaining the sort of necessary physical distance while also being physically present in the ways that we need to be to care well for one another?
I'm reminded of a walk I did through our neighborhood. We live in Northeast Minneapolis with a number of different religious backgrounds, and I came with my pet dog up to a person who was going out to celebrate Eid, and I realized he could not have physical contact with the dog, and yet he looked at me and he looked at us and the dog and said, "I can't touch him, but I can smile." Fortunately, it's spring here in Minnesota, or the signs of spring are already here, and I think we have, in many cases, the physical space outdoors to walk by, to wave, to see each other. We can put materials in double bags, like dropping off meals. I guess we're no longer paying for bags in Minneapolis, and so there are opportunities to create methods that don't have that physical transmission contact, and yet have that immediacy that we need, actually in large amounts. One of the quotes I've read in Christianity Today is, "We don't need communion less, we need communion more." And we have to act that out in different ways. Spend more time on social media that we often poo-pooed, but it's time to spend time in activities such as this.
One last question that we have here, John, as a follow-up to that. What about young people in particular? So Amanda wants to know, what can younger people do? I mean, we've heard that younger people are at slightly less risk, at least. Anything that you've seen young people engaged in, or just seen people engaged in, that you think, students at the University of Minnesota, wherever they are at this moment, might consider doing to help their neighbors, their families, etc.?
There's been a lot of examples of that activity. I'd point to our medical students who, especially our senior students, have had a reduction in rotations, and they've taken that time to support other medical professionals, especially with childcare, and it's discrete, segmented population. So one student is assigned to a family, so it doesn't expand very much, and I think there are those opportunities. I would emphasize that the only risk that's reduced is the risk of getting sick.
Mm.
It's not the risk of getting infected. It's not the risk of transmitting it to others. And in some cases, behaviors in our younger people and the urge to do things rather than sit and watch a rerun on television drives higher transmission likelihoods than others, and that has to be guarded against. But is making those, I guess the challenge to each is perhaps broadening out your community to one or two other people that can work together. If there is identified isolation that is causing distress in individuals, that's the opportunity to do repeated activities directed again towards a neighbor, for instance. And you should be waving and saying hi to everyone that you see through windows and the like. You should be asking, do they have food? You should be saying, here's my cell phone number in case you need something. Supporting churches in creating that community, working with pastors in identifying people of concern, helping older people get on social media in some cases yet can be very useful. And so we have to start using our imagination here and understanding what we can do. And University of Minnesota has emphasized the concern about mental illness, and we had a meeting as Faculty Consultative Council with the president and the provost this week, and it's recognized, and this isn't helping it. So looking after each other and maintaining the community that you have is also important. That's the challenge, and that's the prayer.
To wrap things up here, John, you've said that you've got some resources, readings that you found helpful as you've been thinking about this, and particularly Christian response to that. I'm wondering if you could share those with our audience today.
I can throw them up on the screen, but it's probably best for you to add them to the site and to make them clickable. Some of them are more broad resources that are of interest and explanatory. And if there are any mathematical geeks out there or people interested in epidemiologic models, there's some more detailed information in there as well. I'll just pull it up right now and pull it down. And it doesn't show up very well. But here they are anyway.
Are there any of those, John, that you want to highlight or draw our attention to?
If you're unsure about behaviors, going to our state state site, the second line is from our health department, Minnesota Department of Health. CDC is the first line. Third line focuses on methods of worship and prayer in adapting to social isolation. And then we go on to descriptions of the outbreaks, concerns about legal issues, and more geeky stuff.
Thanks so much, John. We will, as you mentioned, we will send those links out to those that have registered for the webinar afterwards here, so you'll no need to scramble to write those down right now. If you're not registered for the webinar and you're joining us, we'd invite you just to send a quick email to hello@anselmhouse.org. That's ANSELM house.org. And we will get those resources out to you as well. That's going to be all the time we have for this noon hour conversation. John, thank you so much for joining us from Wisconsin. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you very much.
To all of you, I would invite you to continue connecting with us online with these forums. Again, if you're not already on the Anselm House email list, would invite you to head over to our website, anselmhouse.org. You can sign up for the email list there, and that's really the best way to keep up on all of these online events that are going to be happening over the next few months. Our next online public event is coming this Tuesday already. We're going to be co-sponsoring a virtual forum with our good friends at the Veritas Forum. The topic is similar to this one. It's coronavirus and quarantine. What big questions can we be asking? And that's going to be a conversation that Andrew Schumann, who directs the Veritas Forum, is going to host in conversation with David Brooks from the New York Times, Andy Crouch from Praxis, and Lydia Dugdale from Columbia University. So that should be a fantastic conversation. You can find that on our website, again, anselmhouse.org, or you can head over to our Facebook page and find a link there. For those of you that are faculty, staff, students at the University of Minnesota, we're going to have a number of discussions, reading groups that are going to be starting up this next week. So again, would point you to the website or our Facebook page to find out more about those conversations. John, thanks again for your time today. Thank you all for joining us online, and peace to you today, to this for the rest of this weekend. And I hope to see you all online again soon. Thanks.